Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We are so glad that you all could make it this afternoon. We are going to get started here in just a minute. We still have lots of people entering the meeting, so we'll get started at in just a minute or two. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We are going to get started in just a minute. We still have people joining the meeting. So we're going to give a second to let everybody who wants to get in, and then we'll get started here. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. We still have some people entering the room, but in the interest of time, we're going to kick this off. Good afternoon. We are so glad you all have joined us for this installment of the Joyce Foundation's Lunch and Learn webinar series entitled Exploring Law Enforcement Support for Community Violence Intervention Strategies. My name is Luisa Aviles. I'm a Senior Program Officer in the Foundation's Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program. And I am so delighted to be joined today by Megan Cahill, the Director of Research at the Police Executive Research Forum, Justin Richardson, who's a Research Associate at the Forum, and Chief Carl Jacobson, who leads the New Haven, Connecticut Police Department. Before we get started, a little bit of quick housekeeping. First, today's webinar is being recorded and in the coming days will be made available on the Foundation's website. Second, we expect to have at least 20 minutes for question and answer, and we encourage you to drop questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen as they come to you, even if the presenters are still speaking. That way we won't interrupt their flow, but we'll be able to have your questions ready when we get to the Q&A section. And then finally, after today's discussion, we'll share key materials referenced in today's webinar, including the PowerPoint deck. So before I hand things over to the presenters, I want to take a moment and share just a little bit of background to make sure we're all starting from the same place. So community violence intervention, or CVI, is a newish term, but for the purposes of this discussion, we're using a definition provided by the U.S. Department of Justice. And according to DOJ, CVI refers to a set of community-centered strategies that aim to reduce violence by preventing and disrupting cycles of violence and retaliation, and by delivering support and services that save lives, address trauma, provide opportunities, and improve the conditions that drive violence. Since 2020, local, state, and federal agencies have made unprecedented investments in CVI as a component of a shifting public safety ecosystem, raising questions about how cities should balance CVI work alongside policing and other longstanding public safety institutions. During this webinar, Megan and Dustin will discuss a forthcoming report that outlines how law enforcement can best understand and support the emergence of CVI as part of cities' public safety ecosystems. The report includes findings from a survey of PERF's member agencies to assess law enforcement's understanding of and attitudes towards CVI as an emerging field, and recommendations from a roundtable of police and CVI leaders. We are also so thrilled that Chief Jacobson is joining us. He was a contributor to the report and to the working session, and will be able to offer a perspective on how his department has built and managed relationships with CVI workers as part of a violence intervention strategy in New Haven. So with that, I will turn this over to Megan Cahill to get us started. Megan, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm really excited to be here talking about this topic that we think is really important to be talking about now when CVIs are really exploding in popularity and in use in cities across the country. So Luisa did a really good job of setting up kind of why we did this work, why we thought this work was really important to take on. There's been a huge investment by the Biden administration in CVIs, and our motivation was really to see what is the role of law enforcement, why, what is their support for CVIs, do they support them, do they want to lead CVIs, or do they want to take a backseat role? So those are the kinds of things we're going to be talking about today. So before my colleague Dustin jumps into the details of the study, I am just going to sort of go over a short agenda. So I'm gonna give you a short overview of PERF. What is PERF, where Dustin and I work. And then I'm going to hand things over to Dustin. He's gonna talk about the definition of CVIs. So Louisa gave us a working definition of CVIs, but part of our work was to sort of dig into what law enforcement really think CVIs are, what they understand them to be, et cetera. And Dustin's gonna talk about what our study entailed, the survey and the workshop, and then findings from both of those. So findings from the survey and from the in-person workshop. But one thing that I wanted to mention before we really jump into the details of the study, what that Dustin's going to do, is that I just want to kick things off by saying what we found for in our research was that there really is a appetite for CVIs among law enforcement agencies. So going into this, we really weren't sure what level of support law enforcement agencies would have for participating in CVIs, supporting CVIs, again, taking a leadership role or taking a backseat role. And what we really found pretty strongly was that law enforcement generally has a lot of interest in CVIs, in what CVIs are doing, and how to support CVIs. So it really was clear to us that there's a lot more for us to dig into beyond this project, so that we can figure out how to support both CVIs and law enforcement agencies in making their partnerships as effective as possible. So not privileging one over the other, just trying to find ways to make that partnership really strong and to make sure that whatever efforts are going on, they can be as effective as possible. So with that, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of PERF. So for those of you who may not know, PERF, which stands for the Police Executive Research Forum, is a police think tank and a membership organization for police executives. We were founded in 1976 and we're located in Washington, D.C. And our mission is to promote progress in policing by conducting rigorous research. We also provide technical assistance to agencies and direct service to law enforcement. And then we also do explore some of the most critical issues facing the field through public forums, workshops, debate, et cetera. On the screen, there's two of our recent publications you can see. So those are some of the topics that we have done convenings around and gotten input from a number of different stakeholders on. So I run the research team within PERF. So we are a small but mighty team within PERF. And we're currently working on a number of critical issues in addition to CVIs. So we're also doing work on extreme risk protection orders, officer safety and wellness issues, and then use of force, with a special focus on data collection around use of force and how agencies can do a better job on that data collection. So with that brief introduction to PERF and what we're going to go through today, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Dustin Richardson, who's going to talk about our research. Take it away, Dustin.
Thank you, Megan. Hello, everyone. And as Megan said, I'll kick off with, again, a brief definition of CVIs. And Louisa touched on a lot of this already. But for those of you who may be unfamiliar, CVIs are initiatives that seek to address the root causes of violence. And they do so by connecting community resources to the small number of people who need them the most. So at the crux of these partnerships, at the crux of these initiatives are partnerships between maybe government and or social service providers and community stakeholders, so well-respected community leaders and organizations. And these partnerships lend credibility to the initiatives, making folks feel safer and thus more likely to engage in violence reduction. And there are a number of types of CVIs under the CVI umbrella. Three of the main ones, and the ones that we focused on with our survey, are those that may operate independently of police, such as the violence interrupter model. So Cure Violence is one example of this. And under this model, violence interrupters seek to mediate conflict and prevent escalation when violence does happen. And these violence interrupters tend to be folks from the community who have a history of engaging in violence, but now seek to help the community heal. There are also CVI initiatives that are led by the community and supported by the police, such as the Hospital-Based Violence Intervention Programs, or HVIPs for short. And these operate out of emergency departments, and they engage survivors of violence immediately after their injury. And the purpose is to facilitate their recovery and offer support both within the hospital and after they've been released. And the thinking behind this is that these folks in these moments are vulnerable and thus more likely to accept services, to wish to do things differently going forward. And then lastly, there are CVI initiatives that are sort of co-led by police. And these are going to be your focused deterrence-based initiatives. Now, there's some debate whether or not these initiatives, such as the National Network for Safe Communities Group Violence Intervention, or the National Institute of Criminal Justice Reform's Group Violence Reduction Strategy, fall under the CVI umbrella. But for the purposes of our exploratory research, we did consider them to be a CVI initiative. And again, these are co-led by the police, and these initiatives seek to replace enforcement with focused deterrence. So what I mean by that is, rather than going around and arresting folks, law enforcement, in partnership with social service providers, community groups, come together, and they identify those who are perpetuating the violence, and they meet with them in an attempt to get them to desist from this violence. And they offer services, of course, ways out of the cycle of violence. And the goal, of course, is to not only reduce violence, but also to build stronger relationships between law enforcement and their communities. But that's just sort of the working definition we had for this project. And I wanted to get us all on the same page before we jump into the discussion of the study, which we will do now. So as Megan said, this was a two-part study. The first part was a survey of law enforcement agencies that measured their support for and involvement in CVI initiatives. And part two of this project involved an expert workshop where we gathered a dozen or so experts to meet for a day in Washington, D.C., and to discuss how law enforcement agencies can be viable partners in CVI initiatives. How can they support these initiatives? Excuse me. And so today we will be presenting some of the very high-level findings. We won't get into the weeds, but as Megan said, the findings that we'll discuss here today are the ones that really show there is an appetite in law enforcement to support these initiatives and to not just be the sole provider of community safety. That survey had a sample of 226 agencies. As Louisa had mentioned, our sample was confined to PERF member agencies as well as large municipal and county agencies. And to be a PERF member, one must possess a four-year degree and subscribe to PERF's founding principles, which essentially emphasize the importance of research, adherence to the highest standards of ethics and integrity, and also accountability to the communities that the agencies serve. And then the large agencies, we consider these to be those with 150 or more sworn officers, and that's just because these are likely going to be the agencies with this initiative, or at the very least have a violence problem that they're seeking to address. Like I said, we asked a number of questions on the survey. We won't get to most of them, but we will get to the ones that, sort of measure law enforcement support for and involvement in these initiatives. So the very first question we asked was, is your agency familiar with CVI strategies? And with this question, we intentionally left the definition vague. We didn't explicitly define them. We simply asked the agencies, are you familiar with community violence interventions that are led or supported by community organizations? And the purpose was to just see, are agencies familiar with this without being prompted? Is this a strategy that they're aware of? And even with this vague definition, we found that nearly 2/3 of our participants are familiar with CVIs. However, knowing about CVIs and supporting them is, of course, another thing entirely. So we wanted to see whether law enforcement supports the notion that the community should be involved in violence reduction. Do officers think that community stakeholders share responsibility for addressing violence? And the answer was a resounding yes. Nearly 9 out of 10 of our participants believe that the community should be involved in addressing violence. And I'm sure you're wondering, as we were when we were designing the survey, yes, but Do agencies think that the community should support their law enforcement efforts, or is law enforcement willing to support community efforts to reduce violence? And so we asked them, in effect, there's this hypothetical CVI. Would your agency prefer to lead the efforts and be supported by the community? Or would you prefer to have a community organization lead the initiative and your agency support that? And we found that fewer than 1 in 5 agencies have a preference for leading these initiatives. In fact, half of them prefer to support a community organization, and another third has no preference. So as you can see from these few findings, there is a healthy appetite, at least among our sample, for supporting community-led efforts to reduce violence. But we all know that attitudes and behaviors are different. Yes, law enforcement seems to be supportive of the idea, but are they actually engaging in this work? And if so, what does that look like? So we asked. And we found that nearly half of our sample has participated in a CVI. Perhaps unsurprisingly, most of this involvement came through the focused deterrence-based initiatives. So of that 45% that's participated in the sample, 38% participated in a focused deterrence-based strategy, 31% participated in a violence interrupter strategy, and 16% participated in an HVIP. And one thing that was of particular interest when we were designing the survey is, are law enforcement agencies willing to work alongside violence interrupters? Are they going to be apprehensive towards working with somebody who has a history of violence? And we asked them, how likely are you to partner with organizations, initiatives that employ violence interrupters? And we found that 8 out of 10 of our respondents are likely or very likely to work right alongside violence interrupters. So again, at least among our sample, there's a little resistance towards working with these individuals. So we know agencies are starting or they're working with CVIs. What, again, has that involvement looked like? And so, again, I'll just present a few high-level findings as sort of a 30,000-foot view of our results. And one of those findings is that much of this involvement is recent. More than half of the agencies have become involved with CVIs as of 2020 or more recently. And most of these agencies are using their own budget to fund their participation. So we asked them questions, about funding sources. Did you use American Rescue Plan funds? Did you use state and local grant funds, so on and so forth? And we found that most agencies are funding their involvement through their own agency budget. And we also asked about their motivations. And there were a number of motivations that the agencies could select from. And across all 3 types of CVI initiatives, we found that the most common motivation to engage in this work is to improve community relations. And then secondarily, agencies engage in this work to reduce crime, to address crime. And this finding was a bit surprising to us, why improving community relations would be more important to the agency than addressing crime. And we can't answer that, why that is the case with our results. But we were discussing that perhaps maybe law enforcement's unfamiliar with the research on CVIs, the research that shows that these strategies are effective tools for reducing violence in the community, and that perhaps if community organizations interested in participating with law enforcement agencies or had an interest in partnering with law enforcement agencies presented this research, then maybe there would be an even greater appetite for engaging in this CVI work. But that's the overview that we'll give of the survey results. We won't get into the weeds here. We'll save that for the report, which will hopefully be out later this summer. And with that, we'll switch gears to the expert workshop. And this workshop was convened earlier this year in March. We brought together 13 experts from law enforcement and the CVI space to discuss really key considerations for law enforcement leaders, as well as suggestions for addressing those considerations for when law enforcement leaders are seeking to engage in CVI work. Maybe you know some of the folks in the photo, maybe you don't. So I'll tell you, we had 9 law enforcement experts, and as you see, we had representation all across the country. And what was special about this group is that every single one of the law enforcement practitioners that attended, they're champions for CVI work. They're champions for community engagement and community involvement. And really, they're trailblazers in this space within law enforcement. Some of them have been engaging in CVI work for a decade so far, to great success. And it was very beneficial to have their input in the room as we discussed these issues. We also had in the room with us a number of CVI experts. And so we had the Community-Based Public Safety Collective, which is led by Akil Isherils, the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, whose executive director is David Muhammad, and the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention, who is led by Fatima Lauren Dreyer. And those 3 organizations provide training and technical assistance and expertise to CVI organizations and law enforcement agencies nationwide. So it was great to not only have their wealth of knowledge, but also a national perspective on the issue. We also invited Baltimore's MONSE, which is the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. And MONSE is perhaps one of, if not the most, has one of the most robust CVI networks in all of the US. They have numerous types of CVIs, ones that work independently of the police, ones that work closely alongside the police. And so it was great to have them in the room, in addition to their partners at the Baltimore PD. And like I said, we all got together, had some discussions ahead of the workshop, then met for 9 hours back in March, and discussed and produced a list of key considerations and accompanying suggestions. And so we'll get to those. Those themes, there were 4 main themes, as you can see here. The first of which, perhaps unsurprisingly, is organizational change. And we all know organizational change can be daunting, but it's something that's important for the success of law enforcement's involvement in CVI, should they choose to participate and support an initiative. And really, the key consideration here is the agency's culture one that fosters community engagement and involvement? And that's because traditional policing differs considerably from CVI work. Officers are to rely less on enforcement and more on the provision of services. So the culture must allow for that. A couple ways that agencies can do that, which we of course know can't happen overnight, but there are steps that police leaders can take, one of which is identifying the appropriate officers. So when the agency's hiring or promoting, seek to hire the individuals and promote the individuals that embody the spirit of community engagement, that have a history of engaging positively with the community in non-enforcement ways. And certainly tap these officers to implement and operate your agency's CVI initiative. Agency leaders can also reward the behaviors that are going to drive change within the organization. One example of this is one of our partner agencies. They, officers are traditionally rewarded for heroic behaviors that put them in danger. However, one agency has started rewarding officers and recognizing officers for community engagement and involving the community in non-enforcement ways. And another one of the panel agencies, as we will discuss here in a few minutes, they provide a raise to officers that are engaging in CVI work, which is quite the way to communicate the importance of this work in such a culture. But you don't want to hear how to change the culture within an organization from me. You probably want to hear it from someone who has done it, somebody who has implemented and operates a CVI in their jurisdiction. So I will pass over the spotlight to our fellow presenter, Chief Carl Jacobson with the New Haven, Connecticut Police Department, who, as Louisa said, has participated in our workshop, has contributed to the final report, and has done this work within his agency. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Carl.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you. I want to thank Megan, Dustin, and Louisa and Perf for having me participate. I'm actually a lot happier than that picture. because our violent crime is down here in New Haven, and we've used a lot of this to do that. Just to start off the history in our department, back in 2006, we had a murder witnessed by, we call street outreach workers, as you know, violence interrupters, and the case went bad and nobody would come forward. And so the officers generally back from that time had a bad interaction and bad impression of violence interrupters. But in 2013, we started group violence intervention with the National Network on Safe Communities. And it took a lot of organizational change and buy-in to get that started. And I would say that's right along with moving into a CVI atmosphere. Now, the history of New Haven is that we have always done community policing. We've always had walking beats. We give our officers phones. We have district managers, and we don't have a community policing unit. We're all community police officers. So we had that background of building relationships and teaching that in the academy. And as we went into GVI, we went into doing intel meetings, which, you know, the National Network will call shooting reviews. And we basically talked about crime in the city 4 days a week. All our units met, the feds met, probation, parole, and we thought of other ways to interrupt the violence instead of just making arrests, like putting GPSs on people from probation and doing all the stuff that we learned for group violence intervention. So the next logical step would be working more with our violence interrupters. The other part of group violence intervention that we taught starting in 2013 in our academies is the history of policing. And we actually had an assistant chief who I went to community meetings with, who apologized for the treatment of certain parts of the community after a homicide occurred, and we were stopping everybody and being proactive and arresting everybody, and that wasn't helping us, right? And we know that. So we talk about police legitimacy and procedural justice and giving people a voice and treatment with dignity. So we had that background moving into working more with our violence interrupters and doing more of a CVI type atmosphere instead of just the GVI, where, you know, I would say we support and we also kind of work side by side in that atmosphere, where GVI, we're a little more lead that that program, where we're having call-ins and custom notifications. And on the CVI side, it's more of a sharing information. But it starts with us giving the information. And I think the police have to take the first foot forward, right? I'm one of those officers that, through my experience with the National Network, I believe that the community needs to give us their consent to police them. And on the path of that is being able to teach the history of policing, negative and positive, and police legitimacy and procedural justice, and moving towards, you know, it was mentioned earlier about the community buy-in. That's what we try to do on a daily basis. So when we started working more hand in hand with street outreach workers or violence interrupters, it was a one-way flow of information. We gave the information we had. They were able to go to places that we're not able to go to. They were able to give a message that when we gave the message, it wasn't heard. When they gave the message, it was heard. And I would say to you that as that relationship builds, and it takes years, it's not easy, but it's something that's so important. It needs to be consistently led from the top and pushed down to your people, that we need to do this to reduce violence. And we saw in New Haven a stark reduction in violence, where we were still doing our regular stuff in community policing, but the only thing different was we were partnering with different organizations and offering people that we want you safe, alive, and out of jail before arresting them. And our arrests went down and our violence went down. And as we continued, you know, I think we all saw a spike through COVID because we weren't able to do some of those things. But then as we continued, we've expanded more to the CVI model with the GVI model, in the way of we have regular meetings with violence interrupters, and it started as a one-way source of communication. We would say, hey, there was a shooting. Hey, this happened. Hey, we're worried about this guy. We're worried about this guy either being a victim or being a shooter. And then we even shared information like, well, we're worried about this guy, but we'll be taking care of that. I mean, you guys need to, if you can, talk to his cousin and his other cousin and his stepbrother so that they don't get involved in the violence. And we saw as we opened up more and pushed that information out, we actually got that trust with the violence interrupters, which was big. And I'm gonna revert to one incident that happened that kind of opened up a door for us. In 2016, we were doing group violence intervention. We weren't working with street outreach workers as much. There was a few of us who were, because it starts with a small group, like was mentioned in the earlier slide. You got to select the right officers, but I would say eventually we have such good buy-in here that pretty much all officers know that we're working hand in hand with them, and all officers are willing to do that. So in 2016, we had a bad 2 weeks where we had like 4 homicides and 12 shootings, and we were heading towards a basketball tournament that went on for 8 weeks every Sunday. And I would put, back then I was a lieutenant, and I would put my plainclothes units, gang units, shooting task force personnel out there to make sure there was no violence. And it was usually a contentious relationship where we would be parked out there with our police gear on, and they would play basketball in there. We would walk the streets, and we'd have uniform officers walking the side streets to make sure there wasn't any violence. But in this particular Sunday, it was going to be 102 degrees. And a few of us got together and said, well, what are we going to do? Like, it's going to be 102 degrees. We're coming out of all this violence. So a few of us said, well, we're going to go to the store and get water bottles and ice for the officers. And then it was a collective agreement, like, hey, why don't we get it for everybody? And we ended up buying 700 water bottles and icing it up. And in between the basketball games, we walked around on the court and handed out these ice cold bottles of water. And we walked around. There would be thousands of people observing the games. We walked around handing out water. We ran out and had to go get more. And I remember a few of the street outreach workers coming up to us because they were giving out ice cream that day. And they said, oh man, you know, you're really outdoing us today. And they really appreciated what we were doing. And now it's a tradition. We still have the Sunday basketball games from mid-July to the end of August. And the police are there in plain clothes handing out water. And not only is it a tradition, people come and look for the water, right? And I remember that first Sunday where even some of the kids playing didn't want to take the water from the police, right? So it was little things like that that the street interrupters really appreciated, and were able to say like, hey, these guys are doing the right things. These guys are trying to keep our community safe too. And that built bonds with us as we move forward. Today, we have a weekly meeting with 4 different of our street interrupter groups, 4 different groups of nonprofits that do street interruptions. We talk about who could be shot or shoot, and they tell us, hey, we're working with that kid. We'll make sure we see him tomorrow. And we have this great relationship. And then the next week we kind of report back, and we give them as much information as possible. Sometimes we give them more than we would ever give, just to make sure that they're safe as well. And it's built this trust and built a relationship that moving forward is gonna, it's already helped us reduce violence, but it's gonna help us reduce violence even more.
Thank you, Chief. I think you summed up a lot of what I'll say with the rest of the presentation, so I can be a little bit abbreviated, did a little bit of my job. So thank you for that. But as I said, the Chief touched on a number of the main themes that came up during the workshop, one of which was implementation. And the key consideration regarding implementation is the agency in a position to engage in this, right? CVIs are really, when law enforcement gets involved with a CVI, it's a promise to do things differently, right? A promise to not rely so heavily on enforcement and instead work on building relationships, on providing services, on addressing the root causes rather than just reacting to the output, which is violent crime. So agency leaders just thinking about partnering with the CVI should first assess their agency's capacity. Do they have the staffing? Do they have the culture? Is this going to be a success, or is it likely to be a success, at least on the agency's part? Because if the agency is to make promises that they do not fulfill, the community is going to be further alienated, putting the department in a worse position than it was when it started. Agencies should also establish the appropriate partnerships. And this is something that comes up, I think, with every single theme. And what it means in reference to implementation is really tapping into those TTA providers and their expertise. And believe it or not, it was not the TTA providers on the panel that made this suggestion. It was, in fact, all 9 of our law enforcement agency partners who have benefited from the support of TTA providers. They have every single one of them identified just how invaluable those resources are when getting an initiative off the ground, or rather beginning engagement in one. And then the last sort of key suggestion for this is to incorporate the community, not only every step of the way, but especially up front. And one of our panel agencies noted that they regularly have community sentiment surveys administered by a third party, which asks community members, what are the key issues that you're facing, and what sort of resources and services could help with that? And that's different in that the police don't just show up, determine what the problem is, and determine how best to handle it. They lean on the community for that information. And as Chief Jacobson said, that's one way to for law enforcement to sort of take that first step, extend the olive branch to show good faith effort. And all of this, of course, can go towards securing buy-in, which we all know is vital to every initiative, and CVIs are no exception. And so again, the key consideration here is do you have the support of your officers and the community? Or you're not going to be swimming upstream the entire time. And some things that agency leaders can do is have respected officers promote the work within the agency, and respected community leaders promote the work in the community, oftentimes alongside one another. And this, though it's important for chiefs to push this work and promote this work, officers need to see similarly situated officers, their peers, also promoting the importance of this work. And at the same time, money talks. I told you one of the agencies give a raise. Specifically, they give a 5.5% pay raise to officers that are assigned to the CVI unit. And those officers are also promoted to corporal, which is one way to certainly communicate the value of this work and secure buy-in. Officers should also have the opportunity to address or express concerns and have those concerns addressed, right? This work is different than a lot of what they may know. And so the agency leaders need to hear those concerns out and address them, right? Our panelists noted that some older officers maybe are a little bit more resistant to this work, thinking it's not real police work or that it lets folks off the hook. So explaining to them what CVIs are and what they are not can go a long way for addressing those concerns. And it's also important to follow through on promises. We talked about this with implementation. It's important here as well. And what I mean is folks are going to need to see results. Cops are going to need to see that it's either reducing crime or building relationships. And the community is going to see that not only is crime being reduced, but that cops are arresting fewer folks and that the services that were promised are being provided. At the same time, everybody needs to maintain reasonable expectations, right? CVIs are not a panacea, and it's not going to solve violence overnight. So it's important that everyone, stays reasonable within their expectations. The last key theme that we'll discuss is the most important aspect of CVI work. I said in the beginning, repeating it here now, but partnerships are the crux of CVI work because ensuring public safety, it needs the support of both law enforcement and the community. Neither can be as effective without the other. And so law enforcement, as the chief said, needs to be the one seeking out these partnerships, right? Law enforcement in many communities has caused a lot of harm. And so one thing that police leaders can do is acknowledge that harm, as they did in New Haven. It sort of extends an olive branch and it shows a good faith effort and that the community, or rather the agency, intends to police differently. You've also got to identify the appropriate partners, not just the officers you have running the show within your organization, but also those community organizations that you partner with. Some organizations may not have an interest in partnering with law enforcement, and that's okay. Agencies, shouldn't try to force folks to, work alongside them. They should seek out the respected community leaders and organizations that are willing to work with law enforcement. And police need to understand that their partners do not need to be pro-police. They just need to be willing to work alongside law enforcement to achieve the shared goal of reduced violence. And lastly, I say it's perhaps the most contentious aspect for last, which is information sharing. And Chief touched on it a little bit. We talk about it at length in our report. It was probably the most talked about subject at the workshop. And it's important when law enforcement becomes involved with CVI that these information sharing parameters are established up front. Officers need to understand that, really the contention surrounds a sort of a one-way versus two-way street. And under the one-way street sort of framework, law enforcement shares information with CVI workers. CVI workers do not reciprocate. And the purpose of that is to protect their safety, to protect their credibility. And we found during our workshop that most officers accept this arrangement. Most officers understand why community workers cannot share information with them. And they, at least the ones that are involved in CVI work, understand that outreach workers are not their confidential informants. So that's sort of a big key. But there are some officers, maybe those that are a little bit more unfamiliar with CVI work, that can experience some frustration, or at least, struggle to trust partners that aren't sharing information with them. So if violence or outreach workers were to share information with law enforcement, it would be in the sense, in sort of what the chief described, right? It's just aggregate sort of information. Hey, we're doing this sort of outreach. We've offered this many services. It's not specifics about who's doing what, or even necessarily who they're reaching out to. It's quite simply just, hey, this is what we're doing with the information that we are receiving, and that can help to build trust on both sides. But ultimately, information sharing is going to look different in every jurisdiction. Each law enforcement agency and their community partners is going to have to determine what works best for them, what their community is willing to accept, and what's going to be effective for reducing violence. But with that, I sort of, we end the discussion of our results, and I'll pass it back over to Megan, who will close us out.
Thanks, Dustin, so much for those comments. So really, I just want to quickly say, as we have mentioned, we have a report coming out. It's going to summarize all these findings, go into a lot more detail on topics you might be interested in. But really, what I think this all kind of says to us is that we need a strong, credible base of evidence for CVIs about how to keep them sustainable and how to address things like partnerships, how we make those effective. What are some potential barriers that could arise during implementation? And then finally, how do we sustain these? So we know that a lot of them, anecdotally, we know a lot of them have shown a lot of promise. They've been really successful. Focused deterrence, if we consider that a CVI, focused deterrence has been shown to be really effective. So how do we sustain those effective interventions once we get them up, once we get them off the ground and working? So I think that this work is just sort of the tip of the iceberg and just sort of our first foray into seeing, what is law enforcement's role here and what else do we need to know? So with that, I will hand it back to Louisa and the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. This has been really informative, and we have a bunch of great questions in the chat here. I know, and I also, folks don't hesitate to drop more questions in for folks in the audience who might have them. Also, you all were busily answering some of the questions during the presentation, which I appreciate. I'm going to read some of those answers out just to make sure they don't slide by anybody, and then we'll get into the rest of them. So there were a couple of questions in the chat about the survey methodology and what information was going to be available. Folks may have noticed that while there was wide representation of agencies, it wasn't equally distributed. And Megan clarified that the survey went to all of PERF members, regardless of what state they were located in. And then the fact that some states aren't included was just a function of none of the state responding to the survey. So it wasn't, everyone was given an opportunity to participate, and it was the 260 odd agencies that replied back. Folks also had a question about, could we find out if our city specifically, was involved in the survey, and if so, could that data be shared? And the answer to that is that PERF, committed to keeping individual responses confidential. So they won't be able to release the data on the agency level, but some amount of it will be included in the full report when that comes up. And also the recording will be available afterwards of this webinar. So thank you, everybody. I'm gonna lift up, there are a couple of questions that that go to the question of, like, how do you get law enforcement, units to participate in these sorts of strategies? How do you get units to collaborate with, and participate in CVI work? What are ways that community can interest law enforcement in this kind of work? And Carl, I'm going to put this to you because you had started to answer it in the chat about, this took a lot of leadership and showing that it was working, which I think is an interesting element. And then another issue that officers had to realize that CVI workers were not CIs and they needed to be treated as partners, even if the information went one way. Carl, I want to lift up that it sounds like you put a lot of effort in, but also the facts on the ground sort of spoke for themselves to a certain extent. Can you say a little bit about what violence has looked like in New Haven when you all started building these collaborations and working in this way with community-based organizations, and say a little bit about the impact that you think that had on buy-in among your officers?
Yeah, and I think as we started group violence intervention and the collaboration of intel meetings and then working with social service providers and kind of putting out a message instead of making arrests. So you got to look back to the history of New Haven. We're a small city of 130,000. From 2003 to 2011, we averaged 22 homicides and 138 non-fatal shootings, which is a lot for such a small city. We started GVI in 2013, and from 2013 to 2019, and we started the practice of warning, making less arrests, picking the right people, intelligence-based policing, all that stuff. So from 2013 to 2019, the homicides and shootings, we averaged 60 non-fatal shootings and 11 homicides. So we cut everything in less than half. So, the proof was in the pudding. We were able to show a product to our officers that, hey, let's do this. And we saw better community relationships. Sure, we were a community policing organization. We walked beats. Guys and girls built relationships with the community, but now we took it one step further and we said, let's reach that hand out to the offender or the person who is most likely to be shot or shoot someone. And I think, and it took a long time, right? I mean, I've been doing this for 10 years, 11 years now. So the transition to CVI was a little easier because we had been doing it so much. But I would say we went through tough times. We went through times when officers didn't want to do it, and it took just leaders saying, you have to do it. This is the way we do business now. Then we wrote a lot of it into our policies and procedures. That's important. And I know I'm a police leader, so I know we don't always listen to our policies and procedures, but we have to get serious about it. Now, the other issue too in policing is our leadership turns over a lot, right? So I've been in New Haven for 17 years. I'm the 11th chief. But we've sustained this because we selected a few people who were below the chiefs, myself included as a sergeant, that I bought in, not right away. I was like, I'm not going to warn somebody and then have to go after them later. But your message to your officers too is yes, we're giving this message, but there's people that aren't going to take those services, right? There's people who still are going to offend, and you're still going to be police officers and do that side of the job as well. You're just going to do it better and to less people. So it really worked out by showing that example. And then a real good example for us was recently when we went through COVID and we weren't able to message anybody or work with anybody, right? Except we were out there on an island, and we saw our homicides blow up to 26 homicides, 22 homicides over a couple years, right? And shootings were over 100 for years. Now, in 2022, we were able to really start doing this stuff again. Shootings went down to 70. We did have 22 homicides last year. But now coming into, I'm sorry, in 2023. Now coming into 2024, last year at this time, we had 12 homicides. We have 6 currently. We had 36 shootings. We have 25 currently. So we've been able to show the officers, hey, look, we're doing this stuff again and it's working. So it's a lot of that. And I kind of missed something before that I wanted to elaborate on too in working with violence interrupters. Not only do we have that weekly meeting, every other month we have a community meeting with them. And we go to different areas of the city. And in those community meetings, we have kids that have turned their life around, turn up and talk about it. We talk to the citizens about we're working with these street interrupters. We're working with Project Longevity, which is our version of GVI. And then we ask the community, what do you need from us? So police, side by side with violence interrupters, are asking the community, what do you need for us? And it was funny because the first one we had, 2 days later, there was a major fight because somebody was having after hours parties. And the people that attended that meeting called us and called the violent interrupters and gave us both the information, and we were able to shut down those after hours parties and prohibit further shootings there. So it really works when we stand up as a united front with them. But I'm telling you, I know it takes a long time.
Thank you so much. Let me take a couple of other questions that are in the chat here that I think are related. One is a question about what are ways that, you know, non-law enforcement folks can work with police to leverage funding for CVI organizations. There was also a question about, you know, what are the political obstacles seen in the implementation of CVI strategies? And maybe I'll put this to Dustin and Megan first, to the extent that this came up in the survey or working session, and then, you know, ask you, Carl, to weigh in as well. You know, these strategies, you know, cost money. They feel newer. They're not established parts of budgets. Can you say a little bit about how police agencies have or haven't been part of helping to get this non-policing work funded? Or, you know, what kind of influence you feel like, or folks feel like law enforcement could have in supporting this sort of broader array of public safety services?
Yeah. So our survey showed that agencies were primarily using their budget to fund their involvement. So it seems like, you know, agencies aren't getting additional dollars to engage in this work. They sort of have to decide on how to divvy up the pie. However, at the workshop, some of the CVI folks had noted the role that law enforcement agencies can play in helping these grassroots agencies, organizations seek grant funding, right? Most large police agencies have some sort of grant officer, grant manager who has familiarity with how to apply for these grants, how to manage them, so on and so forth. And so one thing that the CVI practitioners had said is that this is a role law enforcement can help fill, is working with these organizations, helping them submit grant applications, helping them manage their grant dollars in partnership, or maybe not, with the agency. So I think it's just, and that again would be a way, right, that the agency would show a good faith effort to the community to do things differently, to support community organizations and help them secure dollars so that they too can, you know, join the fight in reducing violence. But it is, of course, an issue. These initiatives, of course, cost money. One of the questions we didn't get to, but that we asked on our survey, was of the agencies who have participated in a CVI, and I think there were around 100, a little over 100, just 2 of them said that they would not participate in another CVI. And the reasoning for that not wanting to participate again was quite simply because of resources. They did not feel that they had the resources to take on another initiative. So that, if anything, seems to be one of law enforcement's major hangups into stepping into this world.
Yeah, if I could speak.
Yeah.
Can oh, I might be frozen. Damn it.
Oh, you're okay,
Oh.
Carl.
Yeah. I'm fortunate because our Project Longevity is funded through the state, but Project Longevity came to me and said, what else do you need? And me and a group of my commanders were like, let's fund the violence interrupters about 2 years ago. So it started with lower amounts of money, but as we've seen it work, they've been able to fund them with more money. And I would also say, if that wasn't available for me, I'm 70 officers short. That's a big chunk of my budget. Some of my budget goes back to the city at the end of the year. I would even think about talking to the mayor about taking some of that money because I'm so short officers. I need the help. If it's violence interrupters, if it's we do a Compass program now, whatever we can get for help, we're going to take it. And I would definitely use some of that to fund it. But we have been fortunate in the funding. Years ago when we first started, we had no funding, but we had a concept and we stuck to the concept and we saw that the concept worked too. So we were using community-based organizations to kind of fill those gaps, but like we couldn't provide housing, we didn't have any. And now 10 years later, we have all that. So I say to you that if you stick with the right concepts and you get the community behind you, these things will work down the road. And we were able to show successes through our state legislature, and now they're funding us.
Fantastic. I'm going to try to squeeze in maybe one more question here, which can go to whoever is interested, whoever wants to pick it up. We have a question around, who should be assessing an agency's capacity to engage in this work, and how do you do that? I think that was a point that that you brought up and that came out of the working session, Dustin, of agencies have to have the capacity to actually be a good partner here, and perhaps saying you'll be a good partner and then failing is worse than if you just decline to partner at all. Can you say a little bit about what you heard from folks around, how do you know if your agency is well positioned to be a partner in a strategy like this?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, this is something that the TTA providers, I believe it, don't quote me, but I believe it was the National Institute of Criminal Justice Reform. They work with the agencies that they're providing assistance to help us assess that capacity. And so I think sort of, if memory serves me correctly, it's important to work with these TTA providers to assess capacity, because agencies, if they're unfamiliar with the strategy, they're probably not going to know what it's going to take. And so that's where they can play a big role. I had one other thing that's escaped me, but working with them. Oh, I know one of the law enforcement agencies on the panel sought to engage in CVI work, specifically the focused deterrence-based models, by just accessing best practice guides online or other resources that these organizations put out. And while helpful, they noted that they quickly realized they were sort of in over their heads and they needed the assistance. So they reached out to one of the providers. Providers came in, showed them where they were doing things incorrectly and helped them get the initiative off the ground. So really the point is agencies who are unfamiliar with this work, who have never engaged in it before, should really lean on the TTA providers that are available to them.
Fantastic. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm gonna wrap us up here. I'm always sorry to leave questions unanswered, but I want to be respectful of the hour that we scheduled for this webinar. As Megan and Dustin mentioned, the full report that they've been discussing here is expected out this summer, so we will make sure to boost that through our channels and distribute it to the folks who registered for today's webinar. This webinar has also been recorded and will go up on the Joyce Foundation's website in the coming days, along with information about our next Lunch and Learn webinar. And thank you all for joining us today. We are so grateful to Megan, Dustin, and Chief Jacobson for their time and for their commitment to this work. And we agree with you entirely that this research is really scratching the surface of some very interesting stuff. So thank you all for joining us and for giving us your time and expertise. And we will look forward to seeing some of you at next month's Lunch and Learn webinar. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day.